This is one. Now the second one. And everything is good. Why do I need to log in? That is such bullshit. I don't need to log in. I don't need to log in. I don't need to log in. Okay, let me see if it works. Okay, everything is good. Everything is good. It works. This works, that works. Okay. Can't I can't put it elsewhere. So, welcome everyone, Paradise FFD, blah 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 blah. I'm basically, as you can see, I'm going to this is a late night live stream. I'm not going to be a lot too hyper. Kind of tired. I'm really tired. So, but I would just wanted to bring out a little stream, relax for a bit, and don't forget to don't forget to watch One Piece. So everything is good. Chat good. This good. So I am. And then can I copy this? No, wait, hold on. Can I bring this here? No, I can't. I can't. I can't. I can't. Okay. Okay, but it's fine. But I have to see the chat. Now there's a lot of people coming anyway, because not a lot of people come to my live stream, but you just have to never give up, continue on the grind, and maybe something good happens in your life. Who knows? Maybe something might happen, or maybe I'll stay a nobody forever. Nah, but for it is what it is. You have to never give up on your motherfucking dreams. Stay motivated, stay hydrated, and whatever happens, happens. And if it doesn't happen, then you won't have nothing to fear. Maybe something good happens in your life, you know. So I got the chat, so I don't need this because I can use this. If there's someone in the chat, I don't think anyone's gonna watch, but it is what it is. You have to always try. Okay. Basically going to play some NBA 2K, reacting to some One Piece nerd shit, and then yeah, then I'm going to end it. It's also not going to be the longest of streams because once again I'm very tired, but I just wanted to get on live for a bit. Maybe who knows? Maybe there's going to be a hidden gem that finally takes me to uh YouTube, the social media promised land. Yeah. Nah, okay, okay. So I go.
Viewers want to know if the Straw Hats are going to get
Oh yeah, basically reacting to Mr. Mosh. These Straw Hats will get fights in Elbaf Saga, the Saga pattern.
fights. And now that we have the Gods Knights as villains, we have that very same question at the start of Elbaf. But if you're hoping for a big fight for your favorite Straw Hat, hold up a moment, as what many readers don't realize is that there is a set, constant pattern for which arcs have fights for certain Straw Hats and which arcs don't. In all of One Piece history, out of 30 story arcs, there are actually only 8 where multiple Straw Hats besides Luffy get fights. Arlong Park, Alabasta, Skypiea, Enies Lobby, Thriller Bark, Fishman Island, Dressrosa, and Wano. And this is because there is a very specific type of storyline where Oda writes Straw Hats besides Luffy getting fights. What it comes down to is whether or not an arc comes at the end of a saga or partway through a saga. To understand what I mean, first we have to break down what the pattern is, and then examine whether or not Elbaf is set to break it. But before we get into it, make sure to subscribe. But first, Manscaped is offering my viewers an amazing deal. Get a 30 get 20. But these storylines actually Zoro winning their fights, arc finales where the Straw Hats face off against shipping with promo code MORGE at manscaped.com. So that aside, one of the things readers love about One Piece are those beautiful classic arc finales where the Straw Hats face off against a large roster of villains, where we get a sort of domino effect of first the weaker and Straw Hats winning their matchups, and then Sanji and Zoro winning their fights, and then finally Luffy defeating the big bad. But these storylines actually don't come around too often and have been particularly rare in the second half of the story post-time skip. And the reason for that is simple. It comes down to the difference between build-up arcs and climax arcs. So to understand what I mean, we need to take a step back and look at One Piece's story structure. One Piece is split up into sagas of varying lengths, and those sagas are composed of individual story arcs. These story arcs are essentially stringing together to build the larger storyline of the saga, with build-up story arcs leading up to the climax story arc that concludes the overall plot of the saga. I've highlighted the climax arc of each saga: Arlong Park, Alabasta, Skypiea, Enies Lobby, Thriller Bark, Fishman Island, Dressrosa, and Wano. I'm not including Marineford as that was a saga specifically about defeats, and for visual clarity I'm removing post-climax arcs like post-Enies Lobby as well. Now you could be a stickler and argue that this Versus 4 Emperors saga has technically retroactively been strangely redubbed by Shueisha as 3 separate sagas, Zou, Whole Cake, and Wano, but narratively speaking these 3 arcs are all functionally one saga as they make up a singular overarching plot and conflict from start to finish, beginning with establishing the goal of taking on 2 emperors, Kaido and Big Mom, to take their road poneglyphs in Zou, and concluding with the final battle against Kaido and Big Mom, defeating them together at the finale of Wano, and thereby resolving the overarching conflict of the saga. It's essentially—
Hold on 1 second. Okay, let go.
Works saga structure of having the goal of defeating Crocodile and saving Alabasta established in Whiskey Peak, and then the following arcs all leading up to the climax and resolution of this conflict.
Altijd al op de fiets McDonald's willen bestellen? Dat kon bij deze
Bruh.
fietsbestelpaal. En Calvijn, die deed de
Bro, I
bestelling.
don't care.
Zijn je zussen van elkaar? Waar heb je zin in?
Wij komen voor de kipnuggets.
Er zit nog een cadeautje bij ook. Iedereen krijgt gratis bikelights.
Cool. Oh shit.
Wel aanzetten, hè? Hans, zet hem aan.
Hold up.
Detours such as Drum Kingdom are still naturally part of this saga, as
Listen, hold on, my nigga. Hold on, my nigga. Listen, I got crossed. He crossed me. Then he dunked. Oh, nah, Alonso Ball? Oh, nah, it starts like this. Hold on.
heading towards the conclusion of the primary conflict of defeating Crocodile in Alabasta, so Zou through Wano is, functionally speaking, a single saga no matter how you spin it, especially considering the Whole Cake Island detour is very blatantly something that plays directly into building up the plot of the Wano arc climax in a much more concrete way than Drum Kingdom does to the Alabasta arc climax. So looking at all these sagas, what is the defining pattern in terms of fights? To begin with, let's define the fights that we're talking about as clear, extended, focused battles for a character from start to finish, where the Straw Hat clearly wins in the end and defeats their opponent. So while in countless arcs various Straw Hats get brief skirmishes, that is not the same as them getting an extended, dedicated fight. Quick victories that are just a few panels don't really count either, as the Straw Hats get those all the time. I think generally readers all understand that when we're talking about a true dedicated fight for Nami, for example, we are not talking about things like Nami fending off Brûlé briefly. We are referring to actual fights like Nami versus Miss Doublefinger or Nami versus Khalifa. So with this sort of definition, looking at the entirety of One Piece, the primary pattern is that first of all, Luffy will almost always get a fight no matter what arc. Right here, I'm indicating every single arc that Luffy gets an actual fight. Now after Luffy, the Straw Hat who gets fights most frequently is Zoro. It's not as frequent as Luffy, but Oda will still give Zoro some sort of a dedicated fight with a clear victory in a lot of arcs. This makes sense as it's a necessity for Zoro's character storyline in a way that isn't the case for the rest of the crew. But for the rest of the Straw Hats, suddenly the rule becomes very clear. The vast majority of Straw Hats are unlikely to get a dedicated fight in an arc unless it's the climax arc of a saga. So despite readers starting every new arc getting excited, speculating if the Straw Hats are going to get fights or not this arc, there's actually not really a mystery as to whether or not it's going to happen. The simple answer is that Oda gives the crew fights when he is closing out a storyline. If an arc is just a build-up arc to something else, then Oda is unlikely to dedicate story space for anyone besides Luffy, and sometimes Zoro, to get their own fight. It's only when we've reached the climax of a full storyline that the majority of the crew will get their fights. And interestingly, even then, it's not necessarily the case that literally every Straw Hat crew member gets a fight. As you can see, even in the climax arcs, there are still some Straw Hats that will miss out on fights here or there. But at least these are the arcs where we can expect multiple Straw Hats besides Luffy to actually get dedicated fights. But what's most interesting is that when looking at these climax arcs, there's even a clear correlation between how significant the Straw Hats fights are in these arcs and how much buildup there was leading up to that climax. For instance, I think that most would agree that outside of Chopper in Skypiea and Usopp in Thriller Bark, the fights for the rest of the Straw Hats in these two arcs were nowhere near as elaborate or intense as in, say, Alabasta or Enies Lobby, or even Arlong Park. Similarly, the Fishman Island fights weren't anywhere close to the level of the fights in Wano. And I think that's no coincidence, as the common pattern is that these sagas with weaker fights for the Straw Hats are also shorter sagas with very little build-up to their climax. A particularly interesting case is Dressrosa, as the Dressrosa saga itself is also arguably just another lead-up storyline to Wano, with it being referenced many times in story that the narrative from Punk Hazard to Wano is essentially one continuous train of dealing with the same conflict heading towards the same end villain. Doflamingo himself is framed multiple times as being essentially a sort of mini-boss on the way to the main boss Kaido. And so the Dressrosa saga is almost this sort of unique hybrid situation, where it is technically defined as its own saga, and on the one hand it does feel as though we do close out a clear chain of events between dealing with Caesar and Doflamingo's subordinates at Punk Hazard, and then closing out Law's storyline and defeating Doflamingo himself in Dressrosa, before kind of resetting in Zou to really turn attention to taking on the bigger threats Yonko Kaido and Yonko Big Mom. But at the same time, at the end of the day, Punk Hazard and Dressrosa are still explicitly lead-up arcs to the big showdown in Wano. So that strange hybrid situation with Dressrosa technically being the conclusion of its own saga, but at the same time a halfway point in concluding a larger storyline, is also reflected in its fights. Because technically, the majority of Straw Hats in Dressrosa got fights, with Luffy vs Doflamingo, Zoro vs Pika, Frankie vs Senor Pink, and Usopp vs Sugar. But at the same time, the other half of the Straw Hats aren't even on the island, and the fights that we do get for the Straw Hats who are on the island are very diluted, with Zoro low-diffing Pika, Frankie holding back a lot, and while Usopp does get a full chapter dedicated to taking down Sugar, it's not a traditional back-and-forth fight. Robin, of course, doesn't even get a dedicated 1v1. So with Dressrosa, Oda was kind of half in. He only kind of went
That's a ball cooking me. Dunk on him.
halfway towards giving the Straw Hats fights, kind of like how Dressrosa itself is halfway a conclusion to a major storyline. So to sum up, the clear defining pattern is that while Luffy is likely to get a fight in most every arc, regardless if it's a build-up arc or a climax arc, and Zoro may occasionally get a fight in a build-up arc, beyond that, Oda doesn't really give fights to the rest of the crew unless it's a climax arc. And the more build-up to the climax, the more significant and intense the Straw Hats fights will be in that climax arc. This also explains why even in several huge and extremely notable arcs such as Whole Cake Island and Egghead, two of the longest arcs in all of One Piece, even in these arcs only Luffy really got a dedicated solo fight, because ultimately these were not climax arcs, they were build-up arcs. Despite how long Whole Cake Island was, it was still ultimately lead up to the Wano arc, where the overarching plotline of defeating both Kaido and Big Mom would actually conclude. In Egghead, despite the fact that we were up against an entire Buster Call with CP0 agents and Seraphim and Vice Admirals, we still got no fights for the Straw Hats, because even in an arc as long and significant as Egghead, it's ultimately just a build-up arc that's kicking off the final saga. Zoro was thrown a bone with Lucci in Egghead, which is probably the least panel time a matchup can have to qualify as an actual dedicated fight for a Straw Hat, but that was it. Outside of that, in Whole Cake and Egghead, the rest of the Straw Hats were not given dedicated fights, despite the arcs being so large, with such high stakes, and with so many enemies to go around, which seems to really cement that no matter how many chapters an arc goes, no matter how high stakes the conflict becomes, if it's a build-up arc and not a climax arc that's concluding a storyline, then the majority of the crew is not getting a fight. So on paper, this suggests to me that even in this all-important final saga of One Piece, we may genuinely have to wait till the actual final war before all the Straw Hats are given dedicated matchups again. Bottom line, that's not a good sign for Elbaf. At least if you were looking forward to all the Straw Hats, or even several Straw Hats getting a fight against the Gods Knights. Now remember, Elbaf is still likely to be a phenomenal arc regardless of whether or not it concludes with the Straw Hats getting victories against Gods Knights. I personally consider Whole Cake Island and Egghead Island to be the best arcs of the post-time skip because they both feature such phenomenal character writing, and I believe Elbaf is set up to feature that in spades as well. But this vision of the Straw Hats getting real, dedicated 1v1 fights with the Gods Knights may not come to fruition, at least for Straw Hats not named Luffy or Zoro. Now the bright side is there are a few signs that Oda may break his usual pattern for this arc that I will get into shortly. But first, let me quickly break down several signs that support the notion that this may not be an arc that concludes with notable fights for the crew. To begin with, we know that the final war is on the horizon, and ultimately the world government and really the Celestial Dragons are the ones who need to be defeated. The Gods Knights have been built up as the Celestial Dragons' most important military arm, as by the end of the story we have no idea how many Marines would even side with the Celestial Dragons once the Celestial Dragons begin to literally commit genocide across the globe. For the Celestial Dragons to have a serious military force in the final war, it's likely the Gods Knights are not going to be eliminated here in Elbaf. I think it's a lot more likely that the Gods Knights are being introduced as villains in Elbaf to play a similar role that the Gorosei and the Seraphim did in Egghead. In Egghead, the Straw Hats fought the Gorosei and the Seraphim, but notably the Straw Hats did not actually defeat any of them in dedicated fights. They had skirmishes, but no conclusive battles. This is because the Gorosei and the Seraphim are both being saved as endgame villains for the Celestial Dragon's side. So the reason that Oda wrote them into Egghead was to establish them as combat threats by showcasing them against the Straw Hats. It was a showcase of the upcoming villains' abilities, but not actually a scenario for the Straw Hats to all get wins against them. It's very likely that the same is in store for the Gods Knights in Elbaf. The Gorosei and the Seraphim got their turn for a showcase in Egghead, now it's the Gods Knights' turn to get their showcase ahead of the final war. And so while it's likely that we will get plenty of action between the Gods Knights and the Straw Hats, ultimately I don't think it will progress beyond skirmishes into extended 1v1s where several Straw Hats are getting to take down several Gods Knights.
I'm trying so hard not to rage at this game, bro. Y'all see this? Y'all see this bullshit, bro? Oh my god, look at this. Chat, get your butt into the paint. Chat, don't F this up. Thank you. Thank you very much. Okay.
This is further supported by the fact that the revolutionaries have been built up as opponents for the Gods Knights, so it's unlikely that the Straw Hats get to take the Gods Knights down instead. However, on the flip side, there is some hope that Oda may be about to break his pattern in Elbaf to some degree and give us some unexpected full fights. But first, it's the month of love, and we have the most romantic islands in One Piece available for you this February. Printed are no immutable rules to how he writes. He can always mix things up, especially this late in the story in literally the final saga. Maybe here he's more ready to write multiple Straw Hats besides Luffy getting fights, despite it not yet being the conclusion of the saga. One thing to consider is that certain Straw Hats absolutely have to get stronger soon. For instance, Zoro needs to defeat Mihawk, the world's strongest swordsman, who is undeniably at least a Yonko level opponent. That level seems a long way away considering Zoro's recent struggles with Lucci. Zoro needs some fights before Mihawk, and considering Zoro is the only Straw Hat to frequently get fights even in build-up arcs, I would not be surprised if Zoro at least gets a 1v1 this arc. But even beyond Zoro, we also know that Elbaf is meant to be an extremely important arc for Usopp, with Oda having built up Elbaf's significance for Usopp literally from the first time we heard of Elbaf. And considering Usopp barely got any action even in Wano, this would be the perfect arc for Usopp to finally get a truly notable, extended, dedicated fight in the New World. Even then, it's tricky, as often with Usopp, his most significant arcs actually don't feature him getting an extended battle, such as the Water 7 and East Lobby storyline, and even the Sugar battle in Dressrosa was again more of a single drawn-out moment. But still, if any Straw Hat besides Luffy and Zoro has a high chance of getting a fight this arc, it would be Usopp. I would also argue that out of all of the Straw Hats, Sanji also desperately needs a fight, because if he is supposed to reach Prime Gaban level at the end of the story, then it's hard to imagine Sanji jumping from fighting Queen to an endgame opponent that's at least Admiral level or higher, without at least beating some other opponent along the way. Lastly, while it is true that Oda likely needs to preserve the Gods Knights for the final war, what's interesting is that the Gods Knights are currently recruiting new members. As such, with the Gods Knights, there is potential for them losing some members here in Elbaf, but then replacing them with stronger members, so that the Gods Knights remain a threat heading into the final war. However, I will save my thoughts on that concept for a future video. Ultimately, I doubt that the Gods Knights as a whole will be defeated here in Elbaf, however. So all things considered, I think the answer lies somewhere in the middle as to whether this will be an arc where the Straw Hats all get fights or not. This is likely to be an arc where the Straw Hats get a lot of skirmishes and action, with some Straw Hats such as Luffy, Zoro, possibly Usopp, and hopefully Sanji getting some legitimate battles, but I do not believe this arc has the level of build-up that you would expect of a storyline where the majority of the crew is going to get major 1v1s. I also think the huge X factor here is the red-haired pirates, who have been teased over and over as playing a major role in this arc, but who have yet to make an appearance. And the last time that we saw them, Oda was actually setting them up to have conflict with the Straw Hat Pirates, as I explained in more detail in this video. I don't think the Gods Knights will be the only opportunity for action for the Straw Hat crew here. I think that Elbaf is set to be an arc to have a decent level of combat, but with not many conclusive 1v1s, as ultimately it should more so serve as a showcase for both the red-haired pirates and the Gods Knights, prior to the start of the final war. We may see a few Gods Knights fall in the process, but ultimately expect Elbaf to establish the future threat of the group, much like Egghead established the future threat of the Gorosei and the Seraphim respectively. So let me know how the conflict with the Gods Knights will go down in the comments below, and if you enjoyed this video then definitely like and subscribe. And if you want to get my extended thoughts on why Sanji is the biggest victim of Oda's arc-based pattern for fights, then you can listen to my podcast that just dropped by becoming a member or supporting me on Patreon, link in the description below.
Volg je natuur. Centerparks.
Guys,
Move my next schedule to tomorrow noon.
don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe. I love you guys, and see you next time. Bye bye.